Is covenantal theology, and why should we care? Unitarian Universalism has a somewhat unique place in America's religious tapestry. We are, of course, a liberal religion, but that's not what makes us unique. Every major religious tradition has liberal branches. And it's worth taking a look at how liberal religious traditions differ from conservative ones. Very briefly, the more conservative a religion is, the more it concentrates on human worthlessness, the power of authority, and the afterlife. You are not worthy of salvation on your own. To avoid eternal punishment, you have to believe and behave in certain prescribed ways, period. Liberal religion emphasizes human worthiness and ethical relationship in the here and now. So, worthlessness, authority, and the afterlife versus worthiness and relationship in this life. Of course, different traditions line up in all sorts of ways between those extremes. A person could write a whole book on it, and some people have. Unitarian Universalists are very much about ethical relationship in the here and now, but we're not the only ones. If you look at the Reformed Jewish tradition, Christian Congregationalists, or disciples of Christ, just for starters, they begin with creedal statements about the nature of God and the soul, but they pretty quickly go to how our religious outlook needs to make our ethics manifest in daily life. To them, what discipleship means in real world practice. What does make Unitarian Universalism different is that we don't start out with a creedal statement at all. We don't have a creed. We have our 7 principles, which we agree to affirm and promote. They don't say a word about God or belief or the afterlife or people's souls. Unitarian Universalists have religious beliefs that are all over the map. One person's an atheist, another is a non-theistic Christian, another is a theistic non-Christian or pagan or mystic. There's just no end to the variety. Suffice to say, our 7 principles are not about what we believe. They're our best stab for the time being about how we want to live with one another and with the world around us. I often say, a creedal statement, be it the Nicene Creed or one of the faith statements I mentioned earlier, represents the end of a long conversation. For us, our 7 principles should be the beginning of a conversation about what that principle means to each of us in real life. Our 7 principles are then an ongoing conversation and a living promise. They've changed in the past. They are likely to change again in the future. Just for the record, when the Unitarian Universalist Association first formed in the 1960s, there were only 6 principles, and they would be unrecognizable to anyone who discovered us, this tradition, in this century. Which brings us to the key word in the principles as they're now constituted, because there's a word for that living promise I mentioned, and that word is covenant. The 7 principle statement in our association bylaws begins by saying, quote, "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote," and then it launches into the principles themselves. And it's worth noting that in that principle statement, the word covenant is a verb. We covenant to affirm and promote. And once you've done it, of course, it becomes a noun. You've used democratic process to construct a living promise between equals. So we're going to take a deep dive into that word covenant. It has multiple definitions and a very ancient history going back 3,500 years to relationships between kingdoms and empires in the ancient Near East. We can break down their treaties, covenants, into 2 kinds, as this morning's reading specified. We have what scholars call parity treaties and vassal treaties. Hundreds of years later, when Hebrew scribes were composing what became variously known as the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, or what some Christian traditions now call the Old Covenant, they modeled their allegiance to their God, Yahweh, using the language of the diplomatic treaties of their day. They were worshipers, and Yahweh was God. So a promise between equals would not have been appropriate. So they framed their covenants as vassal treaties with Yahweh, the Lord, as the superior party. Crucially, though, the ancient Hebrews added an ethical element to their covenants with God. The Encyclopedia of Religion tells us, quote, "The religious covenant called for two different things: allegiance to a single God and observance of mutual obligations in the society, respect for life, property, justice, and so on." And it goes on to say, this was a powerful force for national union. It was an operative principle rather than just a theological abstraction. That is, it impacted how you were supposed to live your life day to day. In other words, ancient Hebrew covenants prescribe both the way they would worship and the way they would act toward one another in the real world. The best known covenant, not the first, but the best known, is what we now call the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments, for the record, consist of 4 ritual rules, how they would worship, and 6 ethical rules. In effect, they were a living promise to worship faithfully, but also to act justly and ethically, including toward those who were weakest. Also, for what it's worth, if you read the Gospels carefully, Jesus of Nazareth, throughout the 4 ritual commandments, he used only the 6 ethical commandments. Jesus was basically a religious liberal. And one gripe I have with fundamentalist Christian traditions today is that it worries so much about ritual and hierarchical rules and cares so little about ethical relationships. That's just my opinion. But here's why that happened. When Christianity became the religious arm of the Roman Empire, the emperor didn't care about Jesus's ethical teaching, and the church stayed in power by pleasing the emperor. So, from St. Augustine on, ethical conduct and right relationship became subservient to authority. Belief in the godhood of Jesus himself and the institutional power of the church and partnership with the Roman state. And even after Rome fell, you could not get to heaven without the approval of the institutional church. For 1,000 years, Europe's religious life was lived through church authority. Unless a person took part in the church's sacraments with church approval, they were cut off from God, no matter how ethical they were in other ways. In its own way, the church did care about ethics and a whole lot about morals. But church authority still decided which issues mattered and which ones didn't. And again, that difference between ethical relationship on the one hand and authority and what you had to believe on the other. And then came the Protestant Reformation in Western Europe, challenging the medieval church's authority. Martin Luther wrote that salvation was between each individual and God, the priesthood of all believers, as he called it. John Calvin's writing was slightly different. He emphasized human depravity and predestination, but also he wrote that the bonds within the church as a community of God. So Calvinist churches, what we call Reformed or Covenantal churches, were kind of fundamentalist traditions with the seeds of liberal religion embedded inside them. You might say they were a conservative religion pregnant with a liberal religion. And I'll say more about that in a couple of minutes. Today, we wouldn't think the differences between various Christian theologies were a big deal. But from about 1550 on, they caused religious warfare between Roman Catholicism, Lutheranism, and Calvinism that killed millions. Religious authority is a ruthless master. After all, if God is everything and human beings are worthless, which is what both St. Augustine and Calvin wrote, then anything you do for God is justified up to and including killing people who disagree with you. Even today, that's still the kind of thinking that gets Planned Parenthood clinics bombed and motivates people to fly airplanes into buildings. Meanwhile, the minority churches of what we now call the Radical Reformation, including Polish and Transylvanian Unitarians, focused on a religion that served worthy humanity rather than the other way around, just as Christian progressives today have worked hard to reclaim the more ethical faith Jesus actually preached. Calvinist churches, including the Swedish Covenant Church, Scottish Covenanters, later known as Presbyterians, and English Puritans, some of whom settled New England in the 1600s, also turned back to the Bible to find guidance on how faithful people ought to live together. Now, this was still mostly based on the ancient Near Eastern Vassal Treaty, but it did include some of the ethical components the ancient Hebrews had added. And that was one seed of liberal religion within Calvinism that I mentioned earlier. In theory, a church's members manifested God's love and law by being in right relationship with one another. So, one of the first legal documents in America was an agreement called the Mayflower Compact in 1620, and a second was the Cambridge Platform in 1637. Now, we don't have time to go into a real detailed study of these historic documents, but they're both important to the evolution of our own religious tradition. Despite its religious language, the Mayflower Compact is a civil agreement. So you could say that the covenant was being brought full circle. It began with secular treaties, which the ancient Hebrews then adapted for religious use, and then Calvinist Puritans came to New England and readapted the idea and began to shape secular American democracy. Important to our tradition's history, the Cambridge Platform laid out what we call congregational polity. Each congregation sets up its own policies, chooses its own minister, and so on. Without that independence between churches, American Unitarianism probably could not have developed in the first place. It certainly wouldn't have developed the same way. Diverse free thinkers though we are, Unitarian Universalists are directly descended from that liberal seed within New England's conservative Puritans. Our covenants have evolved a long way, but as with any evolution, past vestiges still remain. We still operate using procedures similar to the Reformed Church, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists. One important change, we evolved from the vassal treaty model to a parity treaty model. As diverse believers and non-believers, our covenants no longer have anything to do with God. As theologian James Luther Adams put it, they are voluntary ethical agreements between free and equal partners. Or to say that a different way, fundamentalists still talk about covenants, but to them, a covenant is an obligation handed down from on high. One example is what they call covenant marriage. That's all about obligations, mostly the wife's obligation to the husband. Using the parity covenant model, we have a different definition. A covenant is a sincere living promise voluntarily entered into by equals. And this is important. As with any word that has multiple definitions, we need to pay attention to the definition we're using. James Luther Adams was the most important Unitarian Universalist theologian of the 20th century and our leading authority on covenantal theology. Born in 1901 to a fundamentalist family, he eventually became a non-theistic Christian, taught at my school, Meadville Lombard Theological School, and then went on to teach at Harvard Divinity School. In the decades after the Unitarian and Universalist merger, he wrote a lot about covenantal theology. He drew both from biblical history, but also from his ethical training. Quote, "Faith must be the sister of justice," he wrote, "and a purely spiritual faith is a purely spurious faith." Close quote. There's another topic that would fill a whole sermon. In a very short essay in 1974, From Cage to Covenant, he sums up his covenantal theology. He contrasts between what he called the cage, the authoritarian medieval church-state combine, versus the covenant, a society guided by voluntary promises between equals. This and similar essays from James Luther Adams and others strongly influenced the Unitarian Universalist Association's rewrite of our principles in the 1980s. Adams emphasized 5 key points in covenants. First, human beings are at our best when we make serious promises to one another and try hard to keep them. We are, he says, the only animal that makes promises. We are promise-making, promise-keeping, promise-breaking, promise-renewing beings. Our very humanity lies in the way we carry out our promises to our families, our co-workers, our neighbors, and our fellow members of the human family. Now, to me, that alone is a profound statement. His second point is that to be genuine, a covenant must be a covenant of being. It's not just about good words. It's about ethical behavior. Third, the covenant exists for the sake of each individual as well as for the whole group. It is both a gift and a responsibility. The individual is brought into just relationship with the rest of the group, but each individual is also accountable for what the whole group does. If what my church or my nation does is wrong, I share in that responsibility. It's not just about blaming one person, one faction, or one political party. It's not enough just to say, I didn't know what was going on, or there's nothing I can do about it. My covenantal duty is to be informed about what is happening and to try to act on that information. Fourth, Adams says, quote, "The covenantal responsibility is especially directed toward the deprived. Covenantal living demands that we pay attention to those who suffer from society's neglect or injustice, and that again, we try to do something about it." And he also reminds us of the difference that can exist between our covenant and our actions. One task of the covenantal church is to call attention to the gap between people's noble sounding words versus harmful or oppressive actions. You write a sermon about that too. Finally, he makes the point that, quote, "The covenant is not fundamentally a legal covenant. It depends on faithfulness, and faithfulness is nerved by loyalty, by love." Close quote. In other words, covenantal living, for one thing, is not about obeying the letter of the law while through greed or carelessness we hurt people. Violation of a covenant is serious, not because it breaks a law, but because it is a violation of trust. It is a breach of faith. And this kind of living promise calls forth the best that is in us. But we're human. We make mistakes. Promises get broken. So we try again. Our covenant does not ask us to be perfect. It does ask us to look at our own mistakes and try earnestly to correct them. Now, that's a real quick primer on covenantal religion. If you want to know more, I notice the Commission on Appraisal has published a book on that topic. But it really does embody a kind of simple and human faith that goes on beyond belief, I should say, that speaks to the way we conduct ourselves and the way we relate to the world around us. Just getting out of bed each morning makes a statement about life and ultimate reality based solely on faith, namely that life is worth living. It's worth getting up in the morning. Your life matters. My life matters as well. And the future can still become better than the past. That's faith. Not about belief. That's faith. Fulfilling our covenantal promises, being true to one another, honest enough to admit our own human mistakes and cultural shortcomings and trying to correct them, those are simple things. But that doesn't make them easy. We can only do our best. Let us do our best together. Amen. May it be so.